Hello, everybody, and welcome to Avid Reader Bookshop, and hello to the huge amount of people that have just piled into our Zoom room. Hello, Zoom. Tiny little mic camera here is 100 people in real life. So that's very exciting. And welcome. Just grab a seat anywhere. That's fantastic. So a couple of bits of housekeeping before we start the event tonight. If you have your phone on you, if you could turn to silent, that'd be awesome. Just so that we don't get ringing in the middle, particularly as this is being recorded for Radio National. So we don't want any ambient noises that we can control. The other thing that I wanted to let people in the room know is that the easiest way to get to a toilet is to just head down and out through where the cars are there. And in the very corner, there's a lit cubicle, and there's it's easy to get to toilet cubicle in the corner, which is the easiest way to get to the loo. And also for anyone here in our room, in real life, we have the books front and centre at the counter. So feel free to, we're going to go to a signing afterwards. If you're on Zoom, what we're going to do is we're going to put the link to the book. You can order online, and that's there in the chat bar. I think it'll probably be there right now as Yana is at the counter sending that through. And also, if you do want a personally signed copy, you could call Avid on 07 3846 3422 and pay for the book over the phone, and we can get it personally signed to you as well. So that's another little special extra when we get the author in the room with us. And to be honest, it has been a little bit of an effort to get the author in the room with us. We've been making jokes that if you want to know when the lockdown is, you can just check when the women's stock event is rescheduled, and that's when the lockdown will be. I think that now that we've announced that 4 weeks' time everything's opening up, I think maybe the pandemic has given up on shutting this event down. But please, thank you all so very, very much for bearing with us. And everybody has, and all of you people on Zoom as well, have been so polite and so fantastic every time we've had to reschedule this. This has been the loveliest audience I've ever actually had to deal with. There's been, you know, no very angry people emailing us, oh no, we can't cancel the event. It's been wonderful to have you guys bear with us as we cancel and reschedule for the 5th time. So it's really exciting. Okay, so on that note, I'm going to start the proceedings. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on. In this area, the Yagara and the Turrbal people. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to acknowledge that because we have a Zoom audience here with us tonight, we are zooming out onto the lands of many different Aboriginal people, and that I'd like to acknowledge the elders wherever you may be zooming in from as well. This is Aboriginal land, always was, and sovereignty was never ceded. So on that note, I'd like to welcome you to this fantastic event for the Women's Doc with Caroline de Costa, and to introduce you to our host for tonight, who is Cathy van Extel. Cathy is a reporter and producer for Radio National Breakfast, based in Brisbane. She's a journalist with more than 25 years experience in radio reporting, presenting and documentary making. In 2001, she was awarded a Walkley Commendation for ABC coverage of the September 11 terrorist attack. Cathy is a former Canberra Press Gallery journalist and presenter of ABC Canberra Breakfast Radio. Everybody please welcome Cathy van Extel. Thank you, everybody.
Well, we have most paid us in this time of COVID, 5th time lucky, Caroline. To those who have persisted through all of these postponements, a very big thank you, and I'm sure your patience will be richly rewarded as we delve into Caroline's extraordinary career and life today. Now, as Christy mentioned, this is being recorded. It's for Radio National's Big Ideas program to be broadcast at a later date. I can't tell you when that will be, but keep an eye on our website. If you have any questions for Caroline after our chat, there will be an opportunity a little bit later on. And of course, while she's signing your copy of the Women's Doc. Just a quick introduction, because we are going to find out a lot more over the next hour. Caroline de Costa is the first woman to become a professor of obstetrics and gynaecology in Australia. She's a trailblazing feminist and activist who's made such a significant contribution to Australian women getting the reproductive health services that we all need. Caroline is a professor at James Cook University in Cairns, editor of the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Obstetrics and Gynaecology, author of 15 books, both fiction and non-fiction, and mother of 7 children. Please welcome Caroline. Talking to you, there's this wonderfully joyous scene that you describe of a train pulling out of Dublin, bound for Belfast in May 1971. On board, 47 women, including you and your young child. And after a spot of shopping, you all returned to Dublin by train with pockets full of condoms, some of them blown up as balloons, and aspirins. Paint that picture, take us back there.
Yes, well, there were problems with living in Ireland. I had gone there to study medicine, having been brought up in Australia. And one of the problems for medical students, but for the whole Irish population, was the fact that there was no contraception. And although it was possible to get condoms in Northern Ireland, people were a bit loath to do that because not only was it illegal, it was a sin. And the church, the Catholic Church, had a stranglehold on the Irish people at that time. There was, however, a growing group of women's livers, the second wave of feminism in the early 1970s, late 1960s. And some enterprising members of that group decided that it was time to go very public about this issue. And we got together a group of women who would take the train from Dublin, which is in the Republic, to Belfast, which is in the United Kingdom because it's Northern Ireland. We would there buy the condoms, and also we hoped to get the pill, but we didn't have prescriptions. We thought, though, if we got aspirin, the customs officers who we had to go past coming back into Dublin probably wouldn't know the difference, and they didn't. We would make as much fuss as we possibly could. There was nothing at that time called the media. It was the press. So we let the press know that we were going to do this. And shopping was also cheaper in Belfast. So there were 2 motives there, really. It was a beautiful spring day. And we went to Belfast, shopped, got the aspirin, got the condoms, and made our way back to Dublin, to Amiens Street Station. We were a bit nervous, but the customs officers were a whole lot more nervous. Many of them had never seen a condom, so they didn't know what they were looking for. And some of them imagined it would be kind of
large.
Yes, well, yes, I guess they had an opinion about that. And as we passed through the towns of Dundalk, which is on the border, and Drogheda, which is further south, there were groups of women waving to us and supporting us. So that gave us, we were heartened by that. And we did, as you said, blow up some of the condoms into phallic balloons. And we arrived back in Dublin, and we were kind of corralled into a space in the station away from the press, who were doing their best, in the best traditions of your profession, to get on, to get in and get photos and talk. And they didn't really know what they were looking for, the customs officer. They didn't really know what they were doing. I was approached by one who would not look at me, but said, "Miss, have you got," and I can't do a Dublin accent, "have you got any of them things?" And I said, yes, and threw them on the counter. And he was even more embarrassed. We also, although we had them, we didn't give them all to the customs. No, not at all.
You didn't want to have a wasted shopping exercise.
Absolutely, yes.
And so was any action taken against any of the women?
There were threats of it, and there was our names were taken, and there was the question of whether that we were going to be prosecuted and what was the act we were going to be prosecuted under. But in the end, we weren't. But it really started a conversation, which, along with the founding of the Irish Family Planning Association, began the move to get contraception. First of all, just for married couples, but then eventually for all Irish people, and it took years. And that was really the beginning of that movement.
And why did that day make such an impression on you?
Well, it didn't. I only remembered it when in 2015, when I was in my office in Cairns, and I got a phone call from a woman, a lovely woman in Dublin, who said, "I believe you're on the contraceptive train from Dublin." So I said, "Yes." And she said, "We've made a musical about it." I couldn't believe this. It's called The Train, she said. And it's the people who did Riverdance, Bill Whelan and so on, who had made this movie, the story, and wonderful songs in it. And she said, "Would you come to Ireland and be there? The premiere will be in Limerick, and then we're moving to Dublin." So I said, "Yes, I will." So I did, and I went to Limerick, and the opening night was wonderful, and you can imagine the kind of partying that went on afterwards. And then it moved to Dublin, and it played for much longer in Dublin than had been anticipated. It did very well. It's not the kind of thing that moves easily to Broadway. No.
I can't see it travelling beyond Ireland, really.
No,
but it's interesting that you went back to Ireland in 2015 to see the premiere. It must have been an extraordinarily different Ireland to the time in 1971, I think it was.
Oh, totally. Yes. Yeah.
Such social change.
Well, they already had a legalised abortion in Ireland then, and we hadn't in Queensland. It took another 3 years. Yeah. And there was same-sex marriage. And contraception had been there for years. Divorce, which wasn't possible when I was a student in Ireland, it was now normal, and the church had lost its grip. And you'll be aware of the kind of scandals that were accompanying that.
Absolutely. You have a long history of activism, beginning in the 60s when you were studying a medical degree at Sydney University on scholarship at the ripe age of 16. What was it like to be on campus in that heady time of social change?
In 1964, I did medicine, yes. Well, I began medicine. I completed the first year, but I wasn't really sure that I wanted to be a doctor. And there were a lot of other things happening on campus. It was a very heady atmosphere. Richard Walsh and Richard Neville were prosecuted for Oz, and they actually went to jail for a while. Yeah. So there was a lot of action. There were a lot of demonstrations. It was a bit before the Vietnam War was evident to what was happening, but there was a lot of concern about civil rights in the United States and segregation in the United States, and also the position of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. And that was 3 years before the referendum, which actually recognised Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
So those days on campus, or that year on campus to begin with, did that sort of seed you for the activism in your future?
I guess it did. Yes, I was very shocked to discover how bad segregation was, and what the kind of actions that were taking place in the United States then. My first year out of school, I think I started to learn about those things.
You put your studies on hold and started saving money to go to London, where all the action was, particularly for young Australians at that time. But fate had other plans for you. It sealed one night with a chance conversation in the Sydney pub. Tell us about that little journey you embarked on.
Yes, well, London was thought to be the centre of the world when I was at school and when I was at university, and people had gone from Sydney University, Germaine Greer and Clive James and other people who did not reach those levels of fame, but they had been at Sydney University and they had left their mark, and London was the place to go. And I wasn't sure that I wanted to be a doctor, so at the end of that year, I looked for work so that I could save my fare to go to London, and I got a job on Sydney's buses as a bus conductress. On the double deckers to Watson's Bay, but it was going to take me a long time to save the fare. And one night in a pub, as you've said, I met a young man, a New Zealander, and he was on shore leave from a Swedish ship, and he come from New Zealand across to Sydney, and he was working as a deckhand, and the ship was then going to go to Melbourne and then cross the Pacific and go to Europe. He was going to get to Europe, and he said, "You could do that too, because they take women. You know, as a mess girl, you can wash the dishes and so on." So I said, "Well, how do I do it?" And he said, "Well, you look in the shipping news," which was on the back of newspapers, the Sydney Morning Herald. You see which ships are coming in and what the name of the line is. You want a Swedish or Norwegian or Danish ship, Scandinavian, because they will take women, and they're also, well run. And then you go down to the wharf, you walk up the gangplank, and you ask to see the captain, and you ask the captain. And this turned out to be absolutely correct, but I can tell you that walking up the gangplank was quite exciting. I'm going to raise quite a lot of attention from wharfies. And
it was a certain time.
So
you got the job. You got the job,
yes.
And you ended up in Europe eventually with quite an adventure along the way, which was quite an extraordinary experience for a young teen. You ended up, I think, working as an au pair in Paris, and then hit the hippie trail. At what point did you decide, gee, I need to really get back to my thoughts about being a doctor?
Yes, well, I paid off the ship in Piraeus, the port for Athens, and I took a train and stopped off for a while in Italy. And then I went to Paris and got off the train in the morning, walked out into Paris and thought, gee, there's a pretty good contender for the centre of the world here. And so I stayed for about 6 or 7 months and got a job as an au pair then. And lots of people from Europe, Americans and Europeans and a few Australians, were following that trail down through Italy, former Yugoslavia, Greece, Bulgaria, Istanbul, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and then I actually had intended to go as far as Baghdad and possibly even Afghanistan. These places were very peaceful then and wonderful places and cheap to live in. And they had some other advantages too. And so there were always people to travel with. And I ended up in Jerusalem and found that that was really, really interesting. And at that time, Jerusalem was part of Jordan. It was divided between Jordan and Israel.
I think it was another chance meeting with a fellow traveller that encouraged you to think about
that's right.
getting back into
German
medicine.
girls' hostel, run by the Lutheran Church in Jerusalem. I met a girl from Trinity College, Dublin. She was staying there, and I explained to her that I wanted to go back to medicine, but not go back to Australia. She said, well, you could come to Trinity. And they have a medical school and they speak English. And so I wrote to them, and eventually I was accepted, not in Trinity, but in the College of Surgeons.
And how welcoming was the establishment of women?
In the College of Surgeons? Oh, we were absolutely equal with the male students. We were about 12%, but there was really no, there were rules for young women. Yeah, there were, you had to wear a skirt. You couldn't wear trousers. And on the first day I was there, I was pulled up by the superintendent of schools, who was a very fierce-looking man with wild grey hair and an academic gown. And he said, "Miss, go home and change into a decent skirt." So I only had one skirt. So I was mortified, went back, got it, and I wore it for quite a number of weeks. But what then happened was that the miniskirt made its arrival in Ireland. And I wasn't the only woman who was pissed off about this. We quickly got miniskirts, and the superintendent, Dr. Gallen, said, "Where's your skirt, miss?" "Oh, I'm wearing it." There's nothing else in the shops. So after a while, they decided we could wear trousers.
You were in your second year of medical school when you fell pregnant We spoke about the very strong and strict social mores and rules in Ireland at the time, the rule of the church, and just I guess the difficulty for young women, particularly if you were unmarried and pregnant. You decided to keep the baby as a single mum. How tough was it as a 20-year-old living in Ireland at that time as a young mum without a husband?
Well, first of all, I'd say I was very, I suppose, naive. I didn't think anything could possibly go wrong with pregnancy. I didn't know anything about babies, really. As I've said, it was hard to obtain contraception. This was one of the contributing factors. And I did make that decision. It was possible to travel at that time. This was 1968. It was possible to travel to the UK then for an abortion. I decided I didn't want to do that, that I would have the baby. I had some advantages in not having been brought up as a Catholic. I was brought up in a totally secular household, and my family was in Australia. They were supportive, but I didn't have the problems that many young Irish women had in a similar situation. And so that put me in a better position, I think, to deal with any demonstrations of stigma. And I was concerned about this, and later, once I had the baby, located other young women who were doing the same thing, and there weren't many of us, to try and make a group to bring about change. And
in fact, you wrote about it, and also you were written about.
Yes.
So it was really very much about using your personal story to empower other women, or to at least highlight the difficulties.
Yes, I felt that was necessary. Yes, yeah. Because for many of those, well, not many, there were not many anyway, but most of them were in a position where they couldn't do that because their families in the country would see this or hear this, and they would be shamed.
When did you decide to make a career in women's reproductive health?
I suppose during the first years of medical school, because of these things that had happened to me, and my association with the Women's Lib group, and my interest in women's health generally. And then the first obstetrics I did was in my final year, the year 6. And in the book, I've written about the experience I had on the first day, which was of seeing a vaginal breech birth. And it was just magic. And I thought, I want to do that.
And you did.
Well, I did, yes.
So you graduated in 1973. You'd fallen in love with a fellow student during the course of your studies.
Sitting next to me.
Alphabetically, you're right.
Yeah.
You had to marry to take up posts in Papua New Guinea, where you decided that that's where you wanted to take your intern jobs, I think. What drew you? Had 2 small children at that stage when you got to PNG. What drew you there?
I had been there as a student when I had come back once to Australia to show my son to my parents, and that was a very positive experience for us all. And on the way back, I went to Papua New Guinea. I had a friend who was there at the new university teaching English, and I went and I stayed with her, and I spent some time at Port Moresby General Hospital looking at it, and it seemed like a place that I could consider for internship. And we then applied, my husband and I, my then husband, we applied to do it, and we went. They paid our fares from Ireland to Papua New Guinea.
So you spent a year in Papua New Guinea as interns.
Yes.
And then both of you came to Sydney, where you pursued your specialist training. You in obstetrics and gynaecology, and your husband in surgery. You both passed your exams, but you ended up back in Dublin and the UK because the doors were shut to you here in Australia. Why was that?
Well, I was told if I had passed the exam, we don't train women in Sydney. They hadn't taken a woman into training as a specialist obstetrician and gynaecologist. I was working as a house officer in Sydney. Don't care if you pass the exam, you're not going to get a job here. And my husband found the same thing. To some extent, he's Sri Lankan. And although he had passed and other doctors working with him in the same hospital had not, they were going to get the jobs and he wasn't. So we had 6 months in Sydney and then we went back to Ireland and spent 3 years training there.
You ended up back in Port Moresby after that that time in Ireland, and I think you returned as a senior registrar. Is that right? You had your 5th baby, I think, when you went back to Port Moresby.
Yeah, she was born in Port Moresby.
She was born in Port Moresby. So you had 5 babies at that stage early in your career. You went on to have 2 more children. How did you manage juggling such a high pressure career, international travel, and so many children, a big brood of children?
Yeah, it was a bit of a juggling act. Once you have children who've grown to a certain age, they're quite good at looking after the younger ones.
So it was outsourcing.
Yes. No, I had lots of help from different people.
It was a different time, wasn't it?
It was a different time. It was, you know, you could find, I had lots of very helpful women, nurses sometimes, who were having children in their own homes and looking after them, for example, in Ireland, and also in Australia when I came back here eventually with the youngest children. There were, in Port Moresby, there were kindergartens, there were childcare arrangements, and we had a wonderful couple living. The houses that you were given to live in were built by the Australian government for expats, so-called. In the back of the house was something called, I'm ashamed to say this, a boy house. And the boy house, of course, was much smaller. It was a little bit like a granny flat, but it was expected to accommodate the boy and his wife and family. We just had a married couple there, and his wife, a very lovely woman called Dagu, was expecting her first child when we were there. So she had a daughter, I had a daughter, and Dagu did some of the housework, and she minded my daughter together with her own, which was a perfect arrangement. And there were kindergartens and schools and so on for the other ones.
I'm just going to interrupt. Steve, have we got a problem with the echo here for the recordings? I know, but I'm just wondering how's it go for our recording. Wow.
It sounds like this. Yeah, or
Maybe
just turn it down.
I could turn this down a little bit because it seems to be coming out here.
That's what I think.
Yeah, we've got those issues there as well.
I know we've got that, but it just, I could hear, I think this one as well. It's not perfect, is it?
And I think it's mostly when Carolyn speaks.
Yes, because she's close.
Stop speaking.
Yeah, because she's sitting close to the speaker.
Do we want to move?
Do you want to move?
Right.
Sorry to do
Sorry,
this, guys, but we are recording, and it just sounded like it was getting louder and louder in my head.
So,
Yeah.
you want me to move?
It felt like it.
Watch out.
Yeah.
And I can move this out away a little bit too, so that it's
Yeah.
Can you try talking to Carolyn again?
Just, yeah, so Carolyn, how are you feeling here? Are you a bit more comfortable sitting
Absolutely
here?
fine.
Yeah,
Yes.
that sounds better
Oh,
to
we've
me.
got it
That's
better. That's
Right.
way better. All right,
Yeah.
we'll move this.
All right, well, thank you very much, everybody, but I don't know about you guys, but it started echoing in my brain.
Yeah, no, I was thinking it was getting worse.
I thought it might be in my hearing aids.
Oh,
Oh.
It wasn't sure.
no, there you go. No, it was all of us.
And now the dripping stops, so we're good.
A little bit there,
Oh, it's
but,
getting
it
it's
was
getting
more
lower.
about that one that
Yeah.
was bothering me.
great.
All right, well, so picking up, Carolyn, I guess I want to go to the social changes that have occurred in your career over 50 years, because it spans an incredible period in our time. Since the 60s, women have been taking greater control of their reproductive health, and of course, more widely, the women's movement have been demanding equal pay, equality in education. There's obviously still a lot of ground to cover, but in your profession, back in 1974, as we talked about, those doors were very tightly shut to you here in Australia. But by the following decade, you were actually part of the campaign here in Australia for change. Tell me a little bit about that and just how tough it was to shift that male dominance in your profession.
Yes, well, it was totally male dominated when I came back. Oh, and of course, when I left, which was 1974, I came back in 1981. I was in Sydney, and in New South Wales, 3% of obstetricians and gynaecologists were women, and most of them were in their 70s. Most of the women were in their 70s because during the Second World War, men went off to the front and women were allowed in to train and work in the hospitals. When the war finished in 1945, the men came back and they said, right, okay, well, I suppose now that you train, you can work, but we're not taking any more. They didn't. From in the particular hospital, the particular Sydney hospital, from 1945 to 1985, not a single woman was trained in that hospital. So there was a problem. And there were some other women in Sydney too who were trained overseas. I was fully trained when I came back. I didn't know anybody anything. And it was to be an obstetrician, and I began working in Western Sydney in both private and public practice. I didn't even have to put my number in the phone book. Remember the phone book? Because I just got so many referrals. But the men I worked with, certainly in Western Sydney, they were very supportive and were happy to share practice and on call. I realised that it was going to be necessary to take on the College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists, which was very hierarchical structure. So I started by nominating for as a state committee, and we have representatives of the Queensland State Committee here. So this was New South Wales. So I started in the early 1980s, but of course I had to be voted on by men because they were all men. And that, I was. There were plenty of misogynist types who were very much against it, but there were enough to open the door a chink or so. And we encouraged younger women or women who were behind us in training to apply and just say, we want to have jobs. And by the way, we also want to have part-time work and the possibility for maternity leave, because we happen to be aged between 25 and 40, which is the time when you say women should be having their children if we want to have them. So both those things happened. But it took 20 years until there were 50% of the trainees coming into the training. The training takes 6 years now. 50% were women. Now we have much greater numbers. 85% of trainees are women, and more than 50% of fellows are women. And we're starting to think that maybe we need to be looking at how to keep it possible for male doctors to, if they want to do obstetrics and gynecology, to be able to feel they can apply.
And why has that changed? Is that consumers? I mean, is that ultimately women walking with their feet?
Yes, I think so, partly, yes. But it's also women making the decision that that's what they're going to do and working out how to do it. There has been a change from solo practice by specialists to group practice, and that has been very helpful to women. If you can have a practice with 4, 5 women, all of them, have children and families and so on, to share on call and share rostering and so on, that works much better than just one who's trying to work every night of the week. And male obstetricians too have started to do that as well and realise that it's much more friendly.
Family friendly.
Yeah, family friendly, but also friendly to the person themselves. They're not working their butt off all the time.
Certainly the campaign for women's reproductive rights has been a long and hard-fought one. I want to go to that period when you rose to national prominence here in Australia in the 2000s in the debate over the abortion bill. You contrast in the book the easy path to approval for Viagra by the politicians compared to RU486, which in fact became a political bargaining chip. And I was in Queensland reporting at the time in news, and in fact, I remember interviewing you a number of times during this period. But just looking back, it's so bizarre that women's reproductive health was actually tied to the privatisation of a telecommunications company.
Yes.
Can you remind us of that political horse trading?
Yes. So euphoretic, the correct name for it is mifepristone, but euphoretic has been very much part of the lexicon. Was developed in France in the beginning of the 1980s, and it was tested and found to be effective and safe and acceptable to women. So it became available in France, England, many parts of Europe, and the United States. There was an attempt to bring it to Australia, to Victoria, and there were going to be trials in Victoria, and they were very much opposed by Senator Brian Harradine, who was a senator from Tasmania.
Conservative senator.
Yes, very conservative, virulently opposed to abortion. And he held the balance of power in the Howard government. No legislation could pass through the Senate. It could pass through the House of Representatives. This was the Howard government, and but not through the Senate unless Harradine agreed. And so Harradine wanted this terrible drug banned, and Howard wanted to pass the first bit of his privatisation bill for Telstra. So they struck a deal, these two old white men. No thought for women's reproductive rights, women's health, women's thoughts on the matter, women's rights, not at all. And they did that in 1996. And for 10 years, the drug and the whole prospect of medical abortion, and particularly early medical abortion, was unknown to most Australians, to medical practitioners, but also to women.
At the time that RU486 was effectively banned under this political deal, you were working in Sydney, and you talk about the fact that women requiring an abortion at least had surgical options on the ground there. But for many women, of course, across Australia, particularly in regional areas, that wasn't the case. It was a very different story. And you share an anecdote about a patient you cared for after you relocated to Cairns permanently in 1999. Tell us about that conversation and why it had an impact on you.
Yes, well, this woman I had operated on as an emergency in Cairns in 1999, when I was actually settled there. She had had 2 previous pregnancies, which had ended at around 25, 26 weeks, because she had very severe preeclampsia, and she had caesarean sections on both occasions. And the children were alive, but they were developmentally delayed. And she became pregnant again. She did not wish to be pregnant. She had difficulties with her partner. And she had apparently asked about abortion. She came from a remote community and was told that she couldn't have an abortion in North Queensland. So she proceeded with the pregnancy, and exactly the same thing happened. She got severe preeclampsia. I delivered the baby, who was born alive but did not survive very long. And I subsequently saw her for a postnatal check some weeks later. And she was pretty depressed about the whole thing. But one thing she said was her sister had told her that she'd read about a pill, a drug that you could take, and it was available overseas, and it could bring about an abortion early in pregnancy. And wouldn't it be better if she'd been able to get that in Australia? And I had to say, it would have been so much better for you. Yeah.
Given the pain and anguish you've been through.
Yes. And I realised how difficult it was then, because I had been working in the suburbs, but I was in the city of Sydney, and yes, access to, although the law said it was very difficult, there were surgical services which were accessible.
There were options. When did you make the decision to actively campaign for medical abortion?
I don't know that I ever made a decision. It just seemed to come upon me. I wanted to know more about mifepristone. I wanted to understand why we didn't have it. And I tried to approach my college to do something about it, and I was just told to go away, really. They weren't interested in it.
Is that because of the politics?
Well, that's because they didn't believe that abortion was part of obstetric and gynecological care. They didn't think that obstetricians and gynecologists should be involved in abortion at all. No. And some of them still think that. So I went to a conference in San Francisco in 2005 and heard a lot about R486 and how it was used and so on. And I came back convinced that I had to convince the medical profession at least that it was really very important that we get this drug here. And so I wrote something for the Medical Journal of Australia then in October that year, which seemed to start a whole wave of emails from Canberra, from people who...
This wasn't from the medical profession necessarily, but from politicians,
yes,
wasn't it?
Yes, it was, yeah.
And a lot of female politicians,
yes,
is that right?
Yes.
So you had a lot of people quickly come on your side.
I did, yes.
So tell me about how that campaign quickly gathered momentum.
Well, there were lots of people who individually were wanting to have the drug available, but didn't feel that they had the, perhaps the medical background or the knowledge to say this should be available for Australian women. They came together very quickly. I must mention Children by Choice. I must mention the politicians from both sides of the parliament, the AMA, Get Up, all kinds of people suddenly sprang into action. And in just a few months, we had a huge campaign. And the Murdoch press was also supportive, I have to say. So by February of 2006, the private members' bill from the 4 women senators was passed in the Senate. And then the following week, the bill was passed in the House of Representatives. The whole thing was just amazing.
Incredible. At the time, Tony Abbott was health minister.
Tony Abbott was the health minister. And
this is prior to becoming the Prime Minister.
Suddenly it was taken out of Tony's hands.
You've got to share the anecdote that you have about your meeting with our former Prime Minister who reflected on whether he would need an abortion and what he would do.
Yes. So I went to meet him with Shaman Stone, who was very, very, very prominent in the campaign. And he said quite a lot of amazing things. But one of them was, if I was having an abortion, I'd like to just be knocked out and have it surgically. I wasn't quite sure what the response to this should be. At the time, he had on his desk our application, because one of the things we knew was that even if we get the law changed, we won't find a drug company who will bring this drug in. So we had put in, myself and my colleague, Mike Correct, we had put in an application to the TGA to be able to import the drug, but we needed the approval of the Ethics Committee of Cairns Hospital. And initially they declined to give that approval. They sent it to the health minister of the state health minister, who sent it to Tony Abbott. And he said, "Oh, I'll look at your application in due course," he said. So anyway, I came back to Cairns then after this encounter and found that the chair of the committee, the ethics committee in Cairns Hospital, had gone on leave, and she had been replaced by the acting chair, who was a very wonderful midwife, who called an extraordinary general meeting and passed our approval. We sent it down to Canberra, and Tony couldn't do a thing.
So you became an authorised prescriber.
That's
what
right.
did that actually mean?
It meant filling in a lot of paperwork to get the drug, but that we did eventually get approval. We didn't expect to get approval. When we did get approval, we were, because it was to use in our private practices, myself and Mike Correct. I didn't have a private practice. So we used Mike's rooms, and we announced to the general practitioners of Cairns that we now had the drug. I must say that we were able to obtain it from our New Zealand colleagues who were very supportive. And it was sent, we got the first 20 tablets or so arrived in Cairns. And we didn't want any woman, we weren't sure, should we tell the first woman that she's the first woman? Probably not a good idea. We're very experienced at other things in gynaecology. We can probably do this. Anyway, we had a suitable case. It really had to fit very well with the Queensland law too. So we were not really trying to set up a huge abortion service. It was symbolic more than anything at that point. So the first woman came along and we were, yes, this is, expect this, expect that. And we had to, the reason why there is actually outpatient and home abortion in Australia now is really because that's what we did from the beginning. We didn't have anywhere to keep the women overnight. So we gave them the first tablet and then the second tablet. And then we gave them our mobile numbers and said, call us if anything goes wrong. And we were kind of, for the next 4 hours, quite waiting for the phone to ring. But eventually the woman rang, her partner rang. He had been very supportive and the process had been completed and was fine and turned out actually to be very safe drug.
What was the response that you got from women once word had got out that this abortion pill was available, that you were authorised to prescribe it?
Oh, well, it was mostly very positive, yes. We did get hate mail. We still do get some, but mostly very positive.
Have you ever been in a situation where the backlash has been to a point where you've been fearful?
Not fearful. I did have police protection for a while. I had a stalker in Cairns, and the police were very supportive then.
So while you were able to prescribe the RU486, abortion, of course, remained criminal offence in Queensland, in fact in New South Wales as well at that time as well. In Queensland, the law wasn't reformed until 2018. And in the interim, there was this extraordinary case involving a Cairns couple, a criminal case, who were charged after police raided the wrong home, found this couple there and came across a packet of Russian lettered pills that turned out to be the abortion pill. How significant was this case in accelerating law reform?
I think it was looking back at the sequence of events, at the time it didn't seem like it looked like it was going backwards. But that case and this couple were eventually acquitted. And that's a story in itself. Yes, they had got the drugs from the young man's sister in the Ukraine, and the young woman had not thrown away the packet. It had worked, and she hadn't thrown away the packet. So when the police found it, they said, "What's this?" And she said, "Oh, that was for my abortion." And I think that they were trying to pin something on this couple, and in the end, it turned out to be Section 224 of the criminal code. But they were acquitted. And subsequently, Rob Pyne, who was first of all a member of the Labor Party and a member of Parliament, he wanted to bring a bill to change, to decriminalise the very archaic law. And he was not permitted to do this by the Premier at the time. And he became an independent and he tried again to bring the bill, and it progressed to the point where there was an inquiry, a committee was formed to travel around and interview people about what they thought. But in the end, Rob Pyne withdrew those two bills because he was promised that the whole matter would go to the Law Reform Commission. So those events really followed each other. And then it went to the Law Reform Commission. The Palaszczuk government went for an election. We were returned with a majority. And by the time that had all happened, the Law Reform Commission had reported to the Premier that they thought, yeah, it was about time that it was decriminalised and moved into the health regulations. So we had the magnificent spectacle in the Parliament of it being passed with very, soundly, almost exactly 3 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Time's running against us, Caroline, but I do want to talk to you a little bit about the way that technological change has occurred during your 50 years of delivering babies. I mean, obviously, it covers this extraordinary period of technological change across society, and giving birth is no different. You write that after ultrasound, the most significant change has been caesarean.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly in the 60s and 70s, they weren't very common. The number rose quickly in the 80s and 90s. And today there is a view that there are too many being carried out in developed countries like Australia. Is it an issue in your mind?
I think it's something that needs to be at the forefront of our minds, that we want to be doing them for a good reason, which mostly should be a medical reason, but maybe a social reason, and maybe because that's what the woman herself has decided after a great deal of research and thought. I just want to say something about ultrasound too, because ultrasound has made an enormous difference. We had no idea what was happening to the fetus before ultrasound. People laid their hands on and they said, I think that's the head, and then came out breech first. You could hear the heart, you could measure things in the urine and in the blood, but really we knew nothing about what the fetus was.
Certainly not the sex of the baby.
No.
Or if there were twins even sometimes.
Well, that's right, yes. And now they can do the most sophisticated things with ultrasound. And that, of course, has been one of the reasons why we have more caesars too, because it is now, you've learned from ultrasound that it is appropriate to perform a caesarean section. I think that we now, when I was beginning training, there were quite a number of operative vaginal deliveries that were quite difficult with forceps and so on. Difficult for the baby, difficult for the mother, and they often ended up with injury to either baby or mother or both. That, I think, should not be happening. And I think the view is now the baby either comes out easily, vaginally, or comes out abdominally. We should not be desperately trying to pull this infant into the world. Women are also well informed now. They are different too from how they were when I first began. They are older. They are, I have to say, heavier. And these things mean that there are more complicated pregnancies with hypertension, diabetes, large babies, not progressing in labour, and so on. So it's a different population that we're serving now.
What about this notion that there are people who are too posh to push?
Well, that's one way of putting it, but I think if a woman makes a decision that what she wants is an elective caesarean section with her partner there, and she is well aware of the risks of the surgery and of the epidural, and she's aware of the risks of not having a Caesar as well, I think that's reasonable. And I don't think women should be judged in what they decide.
Part of the backlash against so-called medicalisation of birth is the promotion of birth away from hospitals and doctors. You're a strident supporter of women and having choice, what the woman wants. What do you think about this move?
Well, you can have a well-organised home birth service. It is best for women to have their first baby in a hospital, really, even if the woman only stays there for the length of time for the birth. But the safest births are the second and third. And there are, for example, St George in Sydney runs it's a very successful home birth service with access to the hospital if they need it. But the problem is for obstetricians that we have seen what can go wrong and how quickly it can go wrong. So we do tend to be quite conservative in our views on home birth. It's wonderful when it works.
Well, there's certainly been a lot of advocacy by women's groups, by midwives, about so-called normal or natural birth. And it's something that is promoted by the World Health Organization. I know you've attended goodness knows how many births over your 50-year career. Is there such a thing as a normal birth?
Well, I think it's a very inappropriate word to use for something, because the WHO says normal birth and then it excludes a whole lot of things. You can't have a normal birth if it's before 37 weeks or after 42 weeks. The baby has to be head first. Labour has to start spontaneously. You can't be induced. It has to progress. There should be no interference with it. There should be no damage to the perineum. The baby should just come out spontaneously, and mother and baby should be in good shape, in good condition, not really specified at the end. So that rules out an awful lot of women. So are they abnormal? It's not the right word.
You've witnessed changes in the way that women manage their pregnancies and births over this period as well. And you talk about birth being more of an experience now. Is that a good or a bad thing?
I think it is. It's certainly, it's like worrying very much about the chairs at your wedding reception, and not about who you're marrying and what's going to be like for the next 5, 10, 15 years. Yes, I think I would like all women to have a very positive birth experience, but it won't always be lambs gambling in green fields and Adele on the music system or whoever you want in the spa, because things can go wrong and they can go wrong very quickly.
How does social media play into that and unrealistic expectations around pregnancy and birth?
Well, I'm not very good with social media.
I guess how it informs
I can
the patient
an email
coming up with with their wish list for their birth.
Yes, yeah. Well, one of my medical students in JCU made a very thoughtful remark after he'd been on birth suite for a few sessions. He said the only women who come in with birth plans seem to be having their first baby, and I said yes. Once you've seen what can happen. And how it feels, maybe after that you just take it as it comes.
Learn from experience.
Yes, yeah. Certainly make fewer plans.
Let's go to some of your recent advocacy to wrap up this conversation. As editor of the Australian New Zealand Journal of Obstetrics and Gynaecology, you requested an editorial, I think it was late last year, from a world-renowned Melbourne urologist about the lack of research and knowledge of a very integral part of female reproductive system, the clitoris. And I believe that was met with crickets at the time. Is that right? That nobody responded? There was silence?
Well, not from the college, they didn't, no. Yes, Helen O'Connell is the most wonderful woman. She's professor of surgery at the University of Melbourne. She took the clitoris as her topic, the anatomy, as her topic for a PhD, and she's done magnificent dissections in Australia and in America to show it how it really is. And she has been responsible with a whole lot of other people in producing the models, which you can get. I'll tell you later where to get them. When I did I did a launch in Sydney, and I had brought a whole bag of clitorises. I meant to bring some here, but they just all disappeared. They all disappeared that night. But Helen has been a joy to work with. She wrote a wonderful editorial, and The Guardian picked it up, and I think the ABC too. But then we started to get, we did something for the University of Mexico. They had a big international online symposium combining arts and sciences, and we did an hour-long interview, which was then translated into Spanish. And various other organisations have been seeking information, which is great. Yeah. And the information about the clitoris is not made available to obstetricians and gynecologists who are training. There is the clitoris right in the middle of where we work, and it is never mentioned. Really.
Why is that? Well, is it fair? What's going on?
It's because it's only got one function, which is women's pleasure, and we don't really want to talk about that. There's still male hesitancy on this. And in fact, we have one thing I did notice. We have each week we get a newsletter, an online newsletter from the president and other people in the college with all the activities, including things that appear in my journal and STROG. So I waited to see what they're going to say about this editorial, and there was nothing, as you've indicated. The clitoris was not mentioned.
I'm sure they
So
were
we've got
very happy
more work
about
to
that. Just to finish, and away from the medical sphere, actually, Caroline, you took a very national and political stand in January this year by returning your Order of Australia, the medal. This was the controversy around the awarding of the highest honour to former tennis great Margaret Court. It was a huge controversy at the time. You certainly weren't alone. There were others who handed back their medals as well. They felt similarly as strong. But there wasn't a stampede. Why did you feel so strongly about it? And how do you feel about that decision now?
Oh, I feel very positive about it. I spent about 48 hours thinking about it. I had been humbled and honoured to have received the order because I didn't feel that I was the only person who had done any of these things. Everything comes about because lots of people are involved in campaigns. Another reason why I accepted it was because I knew that there are fewer women who are awarded Orders of Australia. But I was shocked that Margaret Court personally was being elevated to a higher level because she didn't appear to have done anything to justify that, but she was well known for her homophobic comments and really horrible hate speech. In itself, I was concerned about that, but I was particularly concerned. My youngest son is gay. He is a wonderful person. He does a great deal for his fellow citizens in Melbourne. And he was one of the people who was targeted by this woman in Western Australia. But not only that, the idea that the government could think it was reasonable to elevate Margaret Court from the second highest level of the award to the highest level, it just didn't make sense to me. And I was gratified when people like Kerry O'Brien also did it, but I had made up my mind to do it before then. One of the things was I had to get up and write to the Governor General, and I was in Melbourne, and I just I couldn't remember where I put the thing because I was moving from Queensland, so it took a while. I had to send it back in 3 bits.
Did you get 3 thank yous?
Eventually, but no, I didn't. I got an email, and eventually they said, yes, thank you, we've got the whole lot. They didn't say much. I was doing it. But I mean, one of the things then I had, as I told you, got hate mail around about the time of the abortion campaigns, and then it more or less died away. But I got quite a lot of hate mail at that time, and I thought, LGBTQI people are having to put up with this stuff all the time.
It's been such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much,
Thank you very
Caroline.
much.
I think we've got a little bit of time for
Yeah,
a couple of questions.
Yeah.
So if anybody's got a question that they would like to direct to
I'll
Caroline.
go about that.
Works.
It works.
Okay.
But if we need it for radio,
Oh, right. Oh, okay. No worries.
just tell us.
So any other any questions from the audience here? There's one at the back. Yes. I'll repeat it so that we can.
Yes, thank you, because I'm quite deaf.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Your book is such an inspiration. Years ago, I trained with you as a medical student at JCU, and you were one of our most inspirational lecturers.
No, thank you.
I had a question, I guess, about, you've obviously been such an advocate for women's rights and social justice over the years. And these days, I guess one of the biggest crises is the climate crisis. And how do you juggle being an advocate with a medical career and a family, and how did you balance all of that?
So the question was, how do you balance having a family, a medical career, and dealing with crises like the climate crisis, as well as all the kind of advocacy that you have been doing?
I'm not quite sure what the answer is, but I think that climate change is the most important thing which is facing us now, and it has huge implications for health. And I direct everybody's attention to the climate action, CAHA, climate action, health advocacy. If you want to support the health reasons why we need to bring about reining in of emissions. I'm not quite sure how the children the children fit in, because they're going to be living here after where we are. So that's important. I'm not quite sure about the juggling. It just seemed to be, once I'd had the first child, I kind of got used to have to plan for the children as well as to plan for studying and passing exams and working.
There's a question on Zoom as well. So there's a question from Elizabeth. So you actually write crime as well as this book. You have a crime series. Can you talk a little bit about your writing fiction? Where did that come from in your busy kind of medical career?
Well, there's actually a connection between practicing obstetrics and crime fiction, which is that quite often you can find yourself in what's now called birth suite, used to be the labour ward, in the middle of the night. No, it's 1 a.m., 2 a.m. And there's a woman there, you're responsible for her care. She seems to be progressing, but not very quickly in labour. You would like her, she would like to have a vaginal birth, but you're not quite sure. You know that if you go home, you'll be immediately called back. There's no point in going to sleep where you are, because you'll be woken up straight away. You need something to read that is page turning, but intellectually challenging. And that is crime fiction, believe me. And I read my way through Americans and Scandinavians and Scottish and English crime fiction in the many years I was a registrar, and also I was in private practice. And then I thought, I could do this. I'd like to try this. So I have a Cairns detective, Cass Diamond.
Fantastic. Well, and we've got some of those books at the counter as well. So if you want to have a look at those. Look, I think there might be time for one quick question to finish off, if anyone has a quick last question. Otherwise, we'll go to the signing table. There's a question at the back there. Yeah.
I don't know if it's a quick question, but Caroline, I would reiterate what Kate said, been an inspiration to a lot of us. With the changing of the law, we didn't necessarily see any provisions within particularly Queensland Health to help women access termination services free of charge. And certainly I work in an area where our major referral hospital does not provide those services, so that clientele will come back to us. And we're really struggling to find that, or to be able to provide that service publicly. Where do you think we go? What do you think the government needs to do to try and further increase access? It's one thing to be able to change a law around something, but access has not necessarily become easier for women.
So the question was that access hasn't necessarily become easier for women, even though the laws have changed. What can the government do to provide greater access for women to the abortion services or gynaecological services?
Yes, well, in fact, the government itself and the health department have been quite good. I've been to workshops and so on where we've worked out the guidelines are for the termination of pregnancy in Queensland are actually very good. You've got to get the doctors to do it. And it's obstetricians and gynaecologists who are not prepared to have to do this. They are still hiding behind conscientious objection. Of course, people who have conscientious objections need to be respected. But it is an ongoing problem. We need to be training our young junior doctors who want to become fellows of the college. They need to have training, much more training than they have now, in the practice of abortion, counselling for abortion, and at the moment, a lot of that work is being outsourced. It's particularly difficult in the second trimester. And I think we have to keep battling and saying and publicising the fact that women still are having to travel. They're having to travel from Cape York to Brisbane to access services that should be available to them in North Queensland. I agree that there is still a problem. It's better than it used to be, but it can be a lot better. And we need to remove the stigma from abortion.
We'll do one final question at the back and then we will have to wrap up.
Just further to that, do you see it as a problem that one of the major maternity hospitals in Brisbane on the south side doesn't offer contraception, even, let alone termination?
I do.
I remember when I was pregnant myself and delivered at the Mater Hospital, the advice on their website on contraception recommended foremost that I breastfeed for contraception.
Yes, yeah. No, I think it's a huge problem. I think that there are 27 hospitals across Australia that are run by the Catholic Church but funded by taxpayers, and it is totally inappropriate that this is happening. Well, not that they're doing it, but that they can do this. And I directed Jane Caro, you'll be glad to hear, is taking this on as a personal mission. I spoke to her as recently as last week, and we looked at the website for the Mater, which of course is a wonderful hospital, and their state-of-the-art diagnosis in fetal medicine is wonderful. But if a woman has a diagnosis of a lethal abnormality, she has to go elsewhere if she chooses to terminate the pregnancy. It says that they run their hospital according to the philosophy and tradition of the Sisters of Mercy, which, no other church has this kind of access, and it should not be happening, in my view.
I think that's a note to end on there, and I'm glad that Jane Caro is taking up the fight too, because she's got a bit of fight in her. That's for sure. Look, it has been absolutely fascinating listening to you today, and Cathy, thank you for doing such a great job with this conversation. It's a really important issue. It's something that we really need to talk about. And yeah, thank you finally for bearing with our COVID shutdowns to the point that we finally got it together to do this event.
Well, I would really like to thank everybody in the Avid Reader and everybody in the ABC who came forward 4 times and then the 5th time. Thank you for hanging in there, and thank you for being so supportive. I've really been so grateful.
Please thank Carolyn for
Wonderful conversation. Look, we are going to move Carolyn inside to the signing table now, so we can talk a little bit more to her there. So do remember your masks when you head in. And we're going to bring you a glass of wine to your signing table.
most importantly.
Yeah, most importantly. And we'll regather inside. Thank you.
Oh, you're in the